All right, today I want to go on to our next session, which is the Rhino Recovery Fund for the Wildlife Conservation Network, a Horny recovery business. This is from Markus Hofmeyr, and I do have to warn you that there is some graphic content in this presentation, which unfortunately is part of the telling the story about what's happening with rhinos.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be able to talk to you today about the Rhino Recovery Fund and rhinos in general. My name is Markus Hofmeyr. I'm the director of the Rhino Recovery Fund, and I'm just going to run through some of the activities we do as the fund and then discuss some of the challenges with regards to rhino management by using the case study of South African national parks as an example of how difficult it is. So the Rhino Recovery Fund is just over a year old. It's one of the newest funds in the WCN funds network, and our key focuses is protecting of rhinos by restoring their landscapes, improving the biological management of rhinos, and making sure that the benefits associated with looking after rhinos or protecting rhinos flows to local people that live in and around with them. They used to exist throughout most of Africa and all of Southeast Asia, but relentless poaching and habitat change has reduced their numbers significantly. There are 3 critically endangered species and 2 vulnerable, and I'll be talking about all of them and how we are actually supporting their conservation. So the Rhino Recovery Fund has already invested in 21 projects. It's slightly outdated, the slide, and in 9 countries, both continents where they occur. And we hope to escalate this with increasing support through the WCN Rhino Recovery Fund network. So one of the key focuses that we have as a fund is to help support projects where landscapes are protected, because that means that if rhinos are safe in that landscape, a whole lot of other species are also safe. So either by having the rhinos as the flagship species, that with the protection of the rhinos, the landscape is protected, or by having a situation where rhinos can move into landscapes because they are safe to go into those areas. But in the end of the day, they are ecosystem drivers, so they need large landscapes to survive in, and they need large, safe landscapes to survive in. Habitat destruction has played a huge role, particularly in Asia, for the three species that occur there. So restoration of habitat is critical to ensure the recovery of rhinos there, but also in the African context where there's a lot of competition for land between conservation and agriculture. The biggest investment we currently can make with the funds that we've got available is to support protected area management, which is critical to ensure that the source populations of rhinos that currently are existing remain protected and can act as the very source populations we want them to be, by taking excess animals off to new areas and spreading the risk and expanding their ranges and improving landscape conservation elsewhere. So the protection of rhinos requires rhino guardians. This happens at each of the populations where people directly go and look after rhinos. The biggest success of keeping wildlife criminals away at the moment is to actually have people literally monitoring rhinos on a daily basis where that's possible. But in the longer term, we want rhinos to be able to roam freely and safely. So anti-poaching plays a major role at the moment, i.e. having enough game scouts and dogs and technology available to monitor and cover large areas of rangeland so that wildlife criminals can be detected when they enter and hopefully prevent them from killing the rhinos, and certainly try and catch them if they did commit the criminal act. But where the longer term and more important investment will come from, and this is where we're hoping to work with the other funds, particularly the Pangolin Crisis Fund, is to disrupt wildlife criminals and criminal networks. Because it's usually these networks that are organized and not only target rhino horn, target pangolins, bushmeat, elephant tusks, lion bone parts. So having a joint strategy at disrupting wildlife networks is key to protecting rhinos as a very valuable natural commodity. And this is what it's all about, the rhino horn. It's the same as your fingernail, it's keratin. So it is quite an unusual situation where something of such natural composition and very little real use for any medicinal or cultural use has obtained the value of almost a gold bar. So a kilogram of rhino horn in current value at the black market is almost worth more than a kilogram of gold. And you need to find ways to reduce the trade in this, the demand, but most importantly, disrupting the actual trade routes, because that's where we'll have the fastest impact. And certainly to have the long-term outcome to achieve this effectively, we need to make sure that people that live in and around rhinos protect them, want to protect them, and therefore become the first level of proper conservation or protection to them, because they won't allow criminals to enter there, or at least they'll be able to be detected. And then if they have a positive association with rhinos and potential livelihood opportunities, it makes it so much easier to protect the species at the different areas where they occur. Quickly about the different species. 2 species in Africa, the endangered, critically endangered black rhino, used to occur throughout the continent, except for true deserts and rainforests. Highly adaptable, very difficult to reintroduce. You need to know what you're doing, and there's various efforts of support to do so. White rhinos, the northern white rhino are functionally extinct. Only 2 females still exist in Kenya in captive conditions. It's the southern white rhino that's been one of the greatest conservation success stories, where only a few individuals survived at the end of the 1800s. Are now up to about 15,000 animals, and they are the ones that will be used to restock even the areas where the northern rhino occurred. Unfortunately, because they are numerically the most prevalent, they also targeted the most for poaching, so their numbers are actually the ones driving overall rhino numbers down, and we need to stop that decline. The 3 Asian species, the 2 in the country of Indonesia, are critically endangered. The Javan rhino only occurs in 1 park on the island of Java, and the Sumatran rhino occurs in little populations or individuals on the island of Sumatra and Borneo. That is the most difficult species to recover, because they live deep in the jungle, very difficult to monitor, very difficult to protect, and translocation is almost impossible because it's so difficult to catch them. A number of initiatives to try and expand their conservation areas, protect the few individuals that are left, and having some form of, at least for the Sumatran rhino, artificial breeding and semi-captive breeding approaches are in place to try and ensure that these 2 species can continue to be seen by our future generations. The greater one-horned rhino doing a lot better. They went down to roughly 200 individuals and have recovered to over 3,500. Occur in Nepal and India, and the key activity, like with the African rhinos, is to expand their populations into new protected areas where the risk of a stochastic event doesn't result in a massive extinction event, because they are too localized in one place only. So recovery is definitely possible, a lot of challenges, and I want to use the case study of rhino recovery in South African national parks as an example how difficult it can be. Some of the infographics are from my colleague Sam Ferreira, who is the large mammal ecologist in SANParks. Just to give you the estimated cost of protecting rhinos, the yearly cost in Kruger is estimated to be $8.5 million just for operations. Very, very difficult to maintain those costs because income has been reduced dramatically by the COVID pandemic, and it has opportunity costs for all the other conservation activities that need to take place. Extensive strategic plans have been drawn up, yet rhino numbers are still declining, poaching is still high. Why is that, and how can we change that? So despite having all of these problems, the South African national parks still hold a significant proportion of the world's rhinos. Almost half of all white rhino that exist are from SANParks or in SANParks currently, and a big percentage of southern black rhinos also occur in the parks. So critically important that these populations remain intact. Some of the key lessons learned is that biological management through translocation is one of the most effective ways to recover a rhino species. They were originally protected in a small park in the east of South Africa. When their numbers grew up enough, they were translocated in fairly large numbers to the Kruger National Park, where they went extinct in the middle of the the 1900s. 351 individual white rhinos were reintroduced up until the mid or late 70s. They were left to expand, and through good protection and the good habitat that they were in, they rapidly grew. That at the beginning of the 1990s, rhinos could be moved out to other parks, private land, other countries. And to date, over 1,500 rhinos have been removed out of Kruger for translocations, and they make up a big percentage of remaining white rhinos that exist in South Africa and being looked after by other entities, particularly the private sector, which need to be complimented for the very good work that they've done. So translocations, a key lesson learned is that you have to translocate endangered species to new areas so that they grow both at the source and at the new area where they're going to. Another good example of how precarious it is not to have all your species in one basket are future climate and global environmental change stochastic events. One example is the extreme drought we had in the Kruger National Park between 2015 and 2016, which not only resulted in deaths, many deaths of white rhino in particular, it also resulted in a complete loss of breeding for an entire year, so that you have a knock-on effect for almost 2 years where no growth in the population took place. These type of events are going to increase, therefore it's critically important to have quite a lot of different areas where rhinos occur. The ability to translocate, the techniques to translocate have been vastly improved, and if the right and most up-to-date techniques are used, there's no reason why rhinos should be translocated at any risk. One of the key findings we had, which was started in Namibia and then very much implemented in sandparks, is airlifting of rhinos out of difficult terrain, being able to recover rhinos where normally vehicles wouldn't be able to get to. Perfectly safe, very efficient, and definitely something that we'd like to take to Asia, where rhinos live in very remote locations and almost impossible to recover by vehicle. So this is one activity that I personally am quite involved with. Also, the way you release rhinos has improved dramatically. Historically, black rhinos in particular had quite a high percentage of post-release mortalities. This can be almost negated completely by doing the right technique. This is by knocking them down and taking all the equipment away, people away, so when they wake up, they're basically in a new area, they don't know what happened to them, and often they just start browsing and walk off. In this way, we've managed to reduce post-release mortalities almost to zero. Diseases also remain a threat. Very few diseases actually kill rhinos, but there are a few, including anthrax, botulism, arboviruses, cyanobacteria. But rhinos are usually their own worst enemy by killing themselves in fights and territorial disputes. And what has become more of a problem now are regulatory diseases like tuberculosis. In Kruger National Park, tuberculosis is a disease that was introduced through the interaction between cattle infected with TB and buffalo in the 1950s, when she spread throughout the park by the buffalo population. And inevitably, also some rhinos become infected. And now they cannot be moved unless proven to be free of the disease, which is proving to be very difficult to do. So fire has been a huge reason, had a big impact. Big fires are going to increase with climate change, something to be taken note of. Cyanobacteria blooms, also associated with climatic changes, kill rhinos. And then just the regulatory component, a disease that doesn't have any real impact on the rhino because they're often just incidental findings, because they're very resistant to the disease, but because of regulations cannot be moved. So as we speak now, it's almost impossible to move a rhino out of Kruger. Therefore, the biological management component, which I referred to earlier, is no longer applicable that readily, and that is a threat to rhino recovery. Other activities that have been done extensively, now also more recently in the Kruger National Park, is the dehorning techniques to reduce the risk of poaching by deterring poachers from trying to hunt rhinos. Certainly a stopgap that can be applied effectively, but rhino horn does regrow, and one of the arguments being used why it should be a sustainable resource. But they do use their horns as tools and social communication instruments. So in time, hopefully this won't be a requirement, but for now it is being used extensively, but has to be done properly. If it's not done properly, it can cause severe damage to the animal. it's unethical, and therefore it's again something that we don't want to perpetuate into the future. Just as a comparison, natural horn loss, they do lose their horns through fighting or various reasons like that. It does regrow very quickly. Another very important lesson we learned in Kruger was the ability to test different transmitter types. So putting on leg collars and horn transmitters and ear tags to try and track rhinos. It's proven to be quite tricky because rhinos are extremely hard on equipment like this. Plus, if you put leg collars on, potentially can damage the animal if they get injured or if they have mud or any other foreign object stuck under the collar. They are very hard on the equipment, so it's most transmitters don't last longer than a year. And also what we've learned, it doesn't put any additional layer of security on them because it doesn't stop the rhinos from actually being killed. It just means they may be detected a bit quicker. It's the more the movement information around the collected data that can be used to proactively protect rhinos. This is the biggest threat to rhinos currently, is poaching. It's been horrible. I've seen too many dead rhinos in my life with these type of injuries. Not only is it horrible when they die, but if they get wounded, inevitably they don't have a good recovery chance. So we do need to work to the point where this is prevented rather than actually having to try and treat it. Now, the big unintended consequence of the poaching is a large number of orphans have been created. Not easy to deal with it because they are specialized. In the Kruger National Park, they do get recovered as soon as they're found. Various techniques to quickly recover them have been developed very successfully. So if an orphan is detected quite quickly, good chance that it will be recovered and can survive. Two ways in which it's done. One is to send them to an intensive facility where they get given milk, the smaller and the younger ones. Very expensive, and it's a tricky process then to get them to the point where they can then be rewilded. Second option is the older orphans is to put them with surrogate mothers and then release them as a little unit, which has been very successful. So all in all, the sandparks example has shown you can really recover rhinos, but you do need to look at all the different aspects of it and be prepared for the onslaught of wildlife crime. Technology plays a big role, is not the be all and end all. And ultimately, if you really want to protect rhinos, we need to make them relevant to society so that people that live in and around them have a positive attitude towards them. Militarization is not going to solve that problem in the long term. It often alienates people that live around parks. But if they see value in rhinos, either through job creation or by some value proposition that makes them feel like these are their heritage, then they will become the best defenders of rhinos. And that's what we should be working on. And that's where the Rhino Recovery Fund wants to invest most of its funds into the future. It's possible, I'm positive, but it's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of funding to achieve these outcomes. So we can recover them, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.
And so I'm going to call back Markus and have a little bit of a Q&A with him. Markus, one of the questions we have on our screen was, the mission of the Rhino Recovery Fund talks a little bit about its benefit to local people. So I thought you could talk about that aspect of your project there.
Thanks very much, and a very relevant question, because at the end of the day, it's easy to say those words, but to find the projects that actually support local people at a grassroots level is not always straightforward, and it's certainly not easy with rhino conservation because it's not an easy thing for a community to own or look after white rhinos, but it's the whole engine that goes around it and how you sort of integrate people that live in and around where rhinos are. It's key. I think we've heard a couple of examples from previous speakers which have shown clear direction on how that can be done, and those are the projects that the Rhino Recovery Fund particularly would like to start supporting more in the future, and that's why it's key to our mission.
This whole issue of climate change is adding another monkey wrench to the rhino recovery projects. And so in Kruger, for example, in 2016, when they had that drought condition there, is there any plans, and what can we do about helping to stabilize rhino populations with the expectation that these kind of droughts may happen more in the future?
Yeah, I think the key aspect is to have them distributed to many areas that they previously occurred in. So not having all your eggs in one basket is very critical. And this will result in a range of rhino protection projects. And some will be in smaller areas and other areas will be in larger landscapes. But ideally, if we can spread rhinos back to their former range as quickly as possible, which we obviously have to make sure we create safe environments for them. But if we create safe environments for them, that means as a rhino being a flagship species, we automatically protect other species. So it's not only protecting rhinos, it's protecting other species as well. And that's a very fundamental biological management tool that we have to apply. And it's happening quite rapidly in Africa. It's just in Asia where it hasn't really scaled to the level that it should do for those species that occur there.
You mentioned about rhinos being a flagship species, but how does that translate to an ecosystem health?
So there are a couple of examples where rhinos have definitely, rhinos and the related investment has resulted in larger landscapes being protected. I mean, Kruger is one of them. Many of the properties in South Africa that form sort of conservancies and collectively look after their rhinos in the bigger area. So you look at the rhino as the focus of the security, and it's fairly intense. But if you manage to do that at scale and over a larger landscape, then you can actually have ecosystem services and processes working. And we want to ultimately work towards a situation where rhinos are no longer under threat everywhere where you put them, but rather having better solutions to make sure that they can fulfill the ecological functionality.
All right, excellent. And then you showed several examples in your slideshows about the difficulties in monitoring rhino populations, whether it's tags or collars and such. What do you think that's going in the future, and how are we going to be able to better use technology to help us monitor rhino populations in the wild?
So again, it's an issue of the size of the property. If it's small, it's easy to track them because they tend to be quite territorial and localized. So that's not too difficult. But if you have large areas like Etosha National Park, the Kruger National Park, Serengeti, Ngorongoro, or you have them in the deepest jungle like Sumatra and Java, it becomes quite tricky to actually have technology play a significant role. So you have to apply what's functional in the particular landscape. Anything you put on a rhino is tricky because they're very hard on the equipment and they don't last very long. So, I mean, there's still, the thousands of transmitters that my colleagues and I have fitted in, particularly in Southern Africa, they'll all agree they last probably, if you're lucky, a year and a half. The bigger, bulkier transmitters, which you can use as a satellite transmitter, maybe 6 months. So I think technology should be better applied to actually protect the rhinos. So you have ways in which you detect people coming in and out of areas. And the actual on the rhino technology should really be for improving the biological management. So it's a matter of making the technology that you've got available for the best use that you have, and don't overinvest in something that doesn't have the best return on investment. So you need to learn from these things. You can't just keep on doing the same thing and think that you're going to have a better outcome.
Yeah, sometimes we throw dollars and technology at a problem that is just, in the case of the rhinos, unsolvable about putting on collars and tags and such. One of our viewers out there, Cassandra, asked a question about whether there were any alternatives to fulfill the demand for rhino products. In terms of the ivory and the elephants, there are some other natural products that have a similar texture for carving that helps supplant some of that demand. Is there anything like that in terms of rhinos that has a similar texture that might serve a way of decreasing the demand for the actual live rhino horns?
Yeah, the rhino horn demand is a bit of a anomaly because it's got such a spectrum of use, from medicinal use to a form of currency for a sign of wealth. So it depends on where the market is that you need to be able to replace it. In Yemen, where a big demand was historically, they did manage to convert the use where rhino horn was used for the handles of daggers to find alternatives. Interestingly enough, in the traditional Chinese medicine approaches, a lot of fake horn actually does go into the market, mostly buffalo horn tips. So it's already happening. The key thing is to drive the use of rhino horn for anything away from an actual product. And for the time being, we can achieve that by disrupting the criminals, but I think that's going to have to be quite a big cultural change in the countries where they're being used, which is not that easy to influence. So rhino horn, unfortunately, due to its value, is going to remain a complex product to try and get off the market and change the use. Lots of people working on it, and we're all hoping that inevitably the demand for it will go away. We have seen cyclical cycles before, but we can't rest on our laurels, and we certainly can't take the foot off the pedal trying to recover them, making sure that they have lots of safe places to live.
Yes, certainly it's wide range of use, both for as a trophy and as a cultural status symbol, as well as its use in the medicinal cultural medicines. Makes it a hard supplement to replace. We got one last question here to wrap up this session. And one of our viewers was asking if you had a particular piece of treasured knowledge that you've gained from your working with the rhinos or the Rhino Recovery Fund.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very privileged to work with thousands of rhinos in my life and been in many countries where I've seen them. And the take-home message for me is this: it's a very highly evolved species that got to a point in its evolution where it hardly had any natural predators until man came along. So if we want to have rhinos to live and be around for our children and our grandchildren to see, we as people have to make a decision to save them. And that means that we need to work as a collective to do that. So we need to make sure that people that live close to them, the land that they're on, their neighbors, treasure them, and that people that don't necessarily have rhinos in their countries can help support the right projects to achieve that. So we need to make a decision that we want to save rhinos, because they don't have the evolutionary adaptability to fight off our skills at killing them so easily.
Yes, it's one of those unfortunate situations where the root of the problem is not some abstract concept, but it's pointed directly at ourselves, and we can look in the mirror and see the role that the human populations have played in the rhino current crisis. Markus, I want to thank you for the time this afternoon to talk with our viewers, to share your story about the Rhino Recovery Fund at WCN, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you very much. Big privilege to be here. Good to see all my colleagues, and thank you for helping save and recover rhinos. Really appreciate that.
We're all doing the best we can to make a difference in this world.